So I'm here today to present one of the more, I guess, unconventional teaching and assessment methods that I use in one of the classes I teach here at Hong Kong U. So I teach across 3 different classrooms within the Department of Politics and Public Administration. Of course, the ever-large and ever-loving Common Core. I teach a gateway course pitched around about the 200 level, but really we get students as far as their 3rd, 4th, and 5th year. Intro to International Relations. And then I also teach a graduate level course, Theories of IR. So I use this news reports idea. I make no claim that I came up with this. I actually was inspired by a conversation I had with Rick during my first year at Hong Kong U about how can I close this gap, because we have this very high order goal. Within our department, within the Faculty of Social Sciences, we are pushing our students to be critical thinkers. And many a student arrives at Hong Kong U and assumes, because I have a PhD, and because I'm at the front of the room holding the clicker, therefore I must know better than they. I have to try my absolute best to discourage this form of logic as soon as I can, as often as I can, and especially for our faculty, we push for this idea about critical high-order thinking, i.e., does theory actually serve a purpose? What was the point of all of this learning to begin with, if only to promote your critical analysis skills? I've one extra hurdle. Many of you will think that you know all about IR. The day-to-day international relations is fascinating. Will there be peace on the Korean Peninsula? Will Steve Mnuchin get to Beijing and actually start this trade war? Who knows what the rise of China might be? Does this work? Yes. Then they come to my class and they think to themselves, what happened? I have a duty. In my great idea, I think that one day they will leave Hong Kong U, go on to more IR studies, or become a diplomat, or meet other IR students somewhere else in a cafe, and they'll start talking about IR. I have a duty then that they have to have a minimum vocabulary that they have to be comfortable with once they graduate out of my class. And the same thing also as I hand them over to more senior professors, other members in my department that also teach the much more advanced international relations classes, they're going to ask, how come none of these students know about realism, constructivism, blah, 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 all the isms, all the big paradigmatic theories. So we often start quite painfully at the beginning, the Peloponnesian War. So it's a historical event between Athens and Sparta, again, many, 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 many years ago, far moons away from Hong Kong. A lot of this is very advanced theory that seems to have no applicability to real life. Even if I blew this whole thing up so you could actually read what the key said, you'd ask yourself, what has this got to do with the day-to-day of international affairs? And of course, there's pushback from students where they say, well, actually, I'm from Hong Kong, so my chance of getting into the foreign ministry, becoming a PLA official, becoming an actual international affairs operator might seem a little bit more difficult than if I was in a classroom in Washington, D.C., for example. So I have to close the gap. So the way that I've done this is I've tried to take on a lot of Rick's initial conversation ideas with me, and I asked my students to prepare 3 brief reports. In total, they are worth 30% of their grade. They have to hit handing this in by week 8. And many of them decide to start trying to hand in these projects by week 3, week 4. So if you think about it, it actually is very ambitious. We're still only in September, start of October. They have to write 300 words of report, and this report is based upon finding a news article, and they have to apply an insight or theory from class. Again, this is decidedly low-tech. They themselves have to go find this, so going back to Rick's earlier comments about this being unflagged, independently driven ideas on their part, and they have to be able to address 2 sort of underlying themes. Are any of these IR, international relations, insights or theories actually relevant? Shock horror. They find a lot of the times, actually this stuff doesn't really help me. Why is that? And they actually write quite an advanced critique of the theory early on without even knowing it. Or do any of these insights have shortcomings or problems in application? So, why do I make the case that this counts as some type of authentic assessment? It's authentic, I guess, in my argument, mainly because it's the second and first points. It's community relevant to our own social context. They're reading the local papers. They're thinking about events in Hong Kong and trying to reapply them towards a more international foreign policy space. They are definitely engaged in the real world. For all of my students that pull out all the articles that are critical about a so-called rise of China, and they're asking themselves, where does this criticism, where does this concern come from? Is it grounded in any theory over time? And obviously, again, this is all of their own self-directed learning and discovery that takes place week upon week over the sort of 8-week deadline. And again, this higher order goal, that I have to break this misconception that they think for some reason I must be the expert. Again, this idea that does any of this theory actually work? Does it actually apply? And so my two mini examples, I will not assume that all of you love international relations the way I do, so let me just briefly explain. We have a concept of the security dilemma. So I feel unsafe in my own individual environment. So I decide that I must now purchase a gun. I must arm myself to increase my security. That act of doing so, now Rick looks at me with suspicion and thinks to himself, wait a minute, I've got a nutter next door that now has a gun. I must now purchase 2 guns to make myself, Professor Rick Lofchesky, feel safe. Now I look at Rick and I think, wait a minute, what's going on there? Now he's got more than me. Now I have to purchase 3 guns, and so we end up in what we typically call a downward spiral in the IR theory, i.e. leading to an arms race. And so students will pull out articles where they see that the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is critical of Japan's defense expenditure, and they will now start to realize, oh, maybe this idea, this verbal fisticuffs that we're seeing between Tokyo and Beijing, has some relationship to this esoteric comment about a security dilemma. So that's a little bit more doable, right? That's like a real world thing that relates something to a real world thing of me buying guns and him buying guns, and now we all have an arms race. I deal with more difficult things, this IR theory constructivism, i.e. that part of our reality is socially constructed. So the idea that identities and institutions and norms have a real world practical effect. Many people say to me, what's a norm? It's intangible, I can't see it. But in Hong Kong, they're around all the time, every day. Does anyone take the MTR? Yep, okay, great, okay. So for some reason, we all get on the MTR. Once we enter the train, everyone seems to comply with the normative standard of not eating or drinking. It is so egregious when someone eats or drinks that it ends up in Hong Kong coconuts, some screaming fit about a kid eating noodles on the MTR. Everyone gets very upset. This is a great example of a norm that somehow Hong Kong people think that being from Hong Kong means you've adopted this MTR norm, which frankly is never really enforced. I've been living here for 20-something years. I've never seen an MTR official come on the train and say, oh, Professor Lofchesky, put that coffee down. We all seem to just know, right? This is the idea about somehow how these norms, what are they, where do they come from? There's a whole research agenda. I had a fascinating piece where a student pulled a New York Times article all about IKEA's role in importing Nordic norms about family, about easy living, about flatbed packing and unpacking of furniture, I guess, into China, and the role of IKEA as a normative agent in promoting societal change. Fascinating that they've made that connection to this IR theory all about how identities shape foreign policy decisions. So again, and I'm not claiming I don't use these more classic assessment methods, but these are typically what's been used, MCQ, short Q&A, etc. So this is a little bit different in terms of pushing them to enter the real world. And since Rick did ask us to do this, and apparently I'm the only one willing to take a punt at this point, can other disciplines apparently apply the idea that I originally took from conversations with Rick? And I think definitely so. Obviously, as Rick mentioned early on, his idea about the photo analysis, other faculty members have talked to me about what they do in art history, and the same idea that they'll be having lessons about how different art history themes are reinterpreted within Hong Kong. You ask your students, take your smartphone, snap a photo when you see this reinterpretation of 1920 Baroque, I don't know what, Liberace style. Obviously I'm not in art history, I apologize. But anyway, but there's a way that you can interact with the contemporary world right here, right now around you, and actually make that sort of authentic assessment with the real world. So with that, I'm also under time, so thank you for your attention.